Fort Clay lay baking under the relentless Texas sun. It wasn't one of the Army's famous modern bases. It was an old place, sprawled out across miles of dusty scrubland, held together by cold concrete and chain-link fences. It was a place where careers went to wait, and where young soldiers often felt their best efforts simply dissolved into the heat haze. Specialist Clara Hayes, known reluctantly to her squad as Rally, was one of those young soldiers. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet, coiled strength that most of the men in her logistics unit, the 52nd Supply Battalion, only pretended to have. She could lift 200 pounds of boxed rations without a grunt, run the 6-mile loop in the time it took most of them to find their boots, and her mind was sharp as a freshly honed blade. But she was in supply, and she was a woman, and at Fort Clay that meant she was invisible or worse, underestimated. Her immediate supervisor, Sergeant Dale Miller, was the main source of her daily frustration. Miller was a man whose career had stalled somewhere around the time he realized physical fitness was required for promotion. He was loud, sloppy, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in assigning Clara the most menial, gut-wrenching tasks the post had to offer. "Rally, where's your hustle, specialist?" Miller's voice boomed across the vast, echoing metal warehouse, where the air was thick with the smell of old oil and cardboard dust. Clara was already dragging a pallet jack loaded with 3 stacks of heavy, old-style military radio batteries that hadn't been in use since the last century. Each one weighed nearly 70 pounds. She was maneuvering the load through a narrow aisle clogged with forgotten junk. "On the move, Sergeant," she replied, her voice low and steady. She didn't bother to stop or even look up. She learned that any engagement with Miller was just an invitation for more pointless abuse. "On the move," Miller mimicked to the 2 privates lounging near the door who snickered obediently. "Listen to the little logistics runner, boys. Think she's built for heavy hauling, not for strategy. Just keep those hands strong, Rally. That's all we need you for." The comment stung, not because of the insult to her physical capabilities, but because it dismissed her mind. Clara had graduated top of her class in advanced logistics and strategic asset deployment, but here she was just the hauler. She wanted to work on the big maps, the plans, the movements that mattered. Instead, she moved batteries. Her ambition felt like a heavy stone she carried in her stomach every day. She had enlisted not just to serve, but to do something important, to prove that her dedication meant more than her quiet rank or her gender. But every day at Fort Clay was a chipping away at that dream, a slow realization that sometimes the only thing that mattered was who you knew and how loudly you shouted. Today's task was even more frustrating than usual. She wasn't just moving batteries. She was tasked with moving everything from the Annex B basement, a forgotten storage unit holding decades of obsolete, top-heavy communication gear, mostly old, heavy, and covered in a fine layer of gray, unsettling dust. It was the job nobody wanted because it was dirty, dark, and required endless trips up and down a narrow, rickety ramp. "All this junk is going to the burn pit, Rally," Miller announced, leaning against a stack of crates that Clara had just finished building. He kicked carelessly at the bottom crate. "Colonel Graham himself signed off on the disposal. Says it's all classified, obsolete, code 0. Make sure you get the master manifest signed by him. He wants to know when his precious junk is gone." Clara paused, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a canvas-work glove. "The colonel, Sergeant. Shouldn't the supply chief sign off?" "Don't you question the chain of command, specialist," Miller snapped, his face instantly turning red. "The commander wants his paperwork tidy. He's in his office, 2nd floor of headquarters. Take the latest batch of manifests up now. And for goodness sake, try not to look like you crawled out of a dryer vent. Head office is clean." Clara nodded once, silently. She felt the familiar fire of injustice, but she contained it. She knew the drill. You swallow the insult, you do the job perfectly, and you wait for the day your performance speaks louder than their prejudice. She peeled off her thick gloves, adjusted her olive-drab uniform jacket, which now had several fresh smudges of basement grime, and collected the thick stack of disposal manifests. The total weight she had moved today was staggering, and her whole body felt a dull, pleasant ache, the kind that reminded her she was strong. As she stepped out of the suffocating warehouse and into the bright sunlight, she took a deep breath. She could feel the rough metal chain of her dog tags pressing against her sternum, where they were tucked safely beneath the neck of her shirt. They were a comfort, a small, heavy piece of metal that reminded her of why she was here and who she was doing this for. She started the short walk toward the headquarters building. It was a classic, imposing brick structure, the kind with wide white columns and perfectly manicured hedges, looking totally out of place in the dusty base. The walk was a moment of preparation. She straightened her posture, pushed the grime of the warehouse to the back of her mind, and focused on her mission: get the final signature from Colonel Graham. Colonel Graham was an imposing figure in base life, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for being ruthless about efficiency and paperwork. He rarely left his office and was known to have the patience of a hungry lion. The last thing Clara wanted was to waste his time. She walked across the neat lawn, the sun beating down, feeling the heavy, bureaucratic weight of the forms in her hand. Just paperwork, she told herself. Just get the signature and go back to the honest work. She reached the headquarters building, nodded to the military police officer at the door, and took the creaking old elevator up to the second floor. The second floor was silent, carpeted, and smelled faintly of polish and stale coffee, a world away from her concrete warehouse. She found the door marked Commanding Officer Carl B. Graham. She took one final, settling breath, mentally rehearsed her brief report, and knocked sharply on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the crisp, impatient voice from inside. Clara pushed the door open, stepped inside, and found herself face to face with the man who had ordered her entire existence at Fort Clay to be relegated to hauling trash. "Specialist Hayes, 52nd Logistics," she stated clearly, holding the clipboard out for inspection. "Here with the final manifests for obsolete gear disposal from Annex B, per your order, sir." Colonel Graham was seated behind a huge, polished cherrywood desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. He didn't look up immediately. He was signing a stack of other documents, his movements sharp and economical. "Put them on the corner of the desk, specialist," he instructed, his voice flat, still not looking up. "And wait." Clara moved to the side of the desk, placing the thick stack exactly where he pointed. She stood at attention, watching the commander's pen scratch across the official papers, feeling the silence of the room press in on her. She felt every smear of dirt on her uniform, every moment of underestimation over the past year. She was here doing his dirty work, and he wouldn't even grant her eye contact. The injustice was thick, but her emotional strength held steady. She waited. Then, just as the colonel finally finished the document he was focused on, he reached out his hand for the manifest clipboard. Clara instinctively moved to slide it over to him. In doing so, her uniform jacket snagged for a fraction of a second on the sharp, carved corner of the heavy wooden desk. It was only a tiny movement, but it was enough. The dog tags, which she had so carefully tucked in, were briefly pulled up. The metal chain slid a few inches against the fabric of her undershirt, and the second, slightly duller piece of metal, her late father's old tag, swung out, clinking softly against the polished wood surface of the colonel's desk. Colonel Graham finally looked up, ready to sign the forms and dismiss the dirty logistics runner. His gaze was sharp, impatient, and utterly dismissive. But then his eyes fell directly onto the dog tag lying flat on his desk. Not just the tag, but the faint, unique engraving near the bottom edge. It was a single, small, almost scratch-like mark, barely visible but distinct. In an instant, the sharp impatience vanished from Colonel Graham's face, replaced by something that looked like a paralyzing electric shock. His entire body seemed to lock up. The pen dropped from his fingers and rolled unnoticed across the immaculate desk. His silver hair seemed to stand on end. His eyes, fixed on the tiny mark on the tag, went wide and utterly blank, draining all the color from his face until it was the pale, shocking white of bleached bone. The sudden, terrible silence in Colonel Graham's office was louder than any shout. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the soft, metallic echo of the dog tag against the cherrywood. Clara Raleigh Hayes didn't understand what she was seeing. The commander, a man who projected absolute, icy control over every inch of Fort Clay, was frozen in place. He wasn't just surprised, he was physically gutted. His mouth hung slightly open, and the breath he was holding seemed to be shaking his whole frame. His eyes, usually sharp and judging, were now glassy, fixed on the small, worn piece of metal, specifically on the mark near the bottom of the second tag. Clara had always kept that particular tag, her father's, as an anchor. It wasn't standard issue, though it carried his name, rank, and blood type. The mark that had captured the commander's terrifying gaze was a simple, stylized crescent shape with 3 tiny, straight lines cut across its curve. It looked like an amateur etching, maybe a mistake from a rushed engraving machine, but to Graham it was clearly more. Clara felt a knot of confusion and a flicker of deep alarm. She had only meant to hand over the manifests. This sudden, visceral reaction from the most powerful man on the base was deeply unnerving. It felt like she had accidentally let loose a ghost in the sterile room. Instinctively, Clara reached out and quickly, almost roughly, snatched the tag back. The cold metal slid under the collar of her uniform, pulling the chain back down where it belonged, against her chest. She adjusted her jacket, trying to cover the accidental exposure. The movement seemed to break the commander's awful trance. Colonel Graham blinked slowly like a man waking up underwater. The shocking white in his face began to return to a patchy gray. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He didn't look at Clara's face. He looked at the spot where the tag had been, as if the image of the crescent was burned onto the wood. "Specialist," he rasped, his voice unrecognizable, no longer the flat, commanding baritone, but thin and dry. You have that tag. Where did you get that?" Clara felt her spine stiffen. She was a soldier, not a suspect, and this was too personal, too invasive. This wasn't military protocol, it was panic. "Sir," she replied, keeping her voice completely level, fighting the urge to lean away from the sudden heat of his intense scrutiny. "My dog tags are standard issue with personal information. That one is a replacement for the standard medical tag, registered with records." That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. It was her father's tag, the one her mother had handed her on the day she left for basic training. Her mother had simply said, "Keep this close." It kept him safe as long as it could. Graham didn't seem to hear her explanation. He was staring at her, but through her, as if seeing someone else entirely. A muscle twitched violently in his jaw. He slammed his hand flat on the desk, not on the clipboard, but next to it. The sudden noise was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Get out," he barked, the commander's voice finally snapping back, but now laced with a frantic edge of hysteria. "Get those manifests signed by Miller. I don't need to see them. Get that junk off my base now. You are dismissed, Specialist." He made a sweeping, aggressive gesture toward the door. He still hadn't signed the paperwork. The efficiency expert, the man who demanded every detail be perfect, was throwing away his own protocol just to get her out of the room. Clara, bewildered and deeply troubled, snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." She quickly retrieved the unsigned manifests and the clipboard, executing a flawless about-face. She walked out of the office, closing the heavy door quietly behind her, her heart pounding a heavy, confused rhythm against the metal tag beneath her shirt. She didn't rush. As she waited for the elevator, she looked back at the commander's door. She could hear a muffled sound through the thick wood, not a yell, but a low, intense, almost pleading sound, like a man arguing fiercely but trying to keep the argument completely private. Clara got into the elevator, descended to the ground floor, and walked back out into the blistering heat. The entire world of Fort Clay suddenly felt different. The sun was the same, the dust was the same, but the undercurrent had changed. The commander wasn't just a tough boss anymore. He was a terrified, haunted man, and she was somehow the cause of his fear. She walked straight back to the warehouse. Miller was sitting on a crate, drinking a sugary soda, still mocking her to the two privates. "Look, here comes Raleigh back from the high and mighty second floor," Miller sneered, tossing his empty can with a clatter. "What did the colonel say? Did he tell you to wash your face, Specialist?" Clara walked directly past him, placing the unsigned manifests on his chest. "Colonel Graham declined to sign, Sergeant," she said simply. "He ordered immediate disposal and directed you to sign the final authorization. He said, and I quote, 'Get that junk off my base now.'" Miller's smirk faltered. He knew the commander's orders were absolute. If Graham had declined to sign and demanded Miller take responsibility for the obsolete inventory, especially a Code Zero disposal, it meant the commander was either insanely angry or strangely desperate. Miller squinted at the forms, his bravado gone, replaced by a sullen worry. "Fine, whatever, get back to work. We're loading the last 2 stacks." Clara didn't wait. She put her work gloves back on and headed for the narrow ramp down to Annex B, but this time, her mind wasn't on the weight of the batteries. It was on the pale, terrible white of Colonel Graham's face and the small, stylized crescent mark on her father's dog tag. She knew with the cold certainty of a soldier who trusts their gut more than their eyes that this mark was not a mistake. It was a brand, a key, and Colonel Graham had recognized it. That night, alone in her sparse, cinder-block barrack room, Clara took the dog tag out. The two tags were worn smooth, but the crescent shape was still distinct on the second tag. It was engraved in reverse, meant to be stamped onto paper or wax, not worn. It looked like a half-moon cut in half again with 3 tiny dashes. It meant nothing to her, only memory. She opened her laptop and went to a secured military history archive. She typed in keywords, obsolete gear disposal, Annex B, Fort Clay, nothing. Then she typed in, crescent symbol, military tag, pre-2010. The screen went blank, then showed a message, access DENIED, classified record. Her confusion was turning into gnawing doubt. Why would a simple, faded mark on a 20-year-old dog tag be connected to a classified security alert? Why would the powerful commander of Fort Clay turn white with shock? She was just the supply girl. She was just carrying supplies. But the mark on the dog tag had just pulled her into a secret she was never meant to know. Meanwhile, back in his pristine office, Colonel Graham sat in the dark, the lights off. He had made a secure, hushed phone call to a number he hadn't dialed in over 15 years. "It's me," he whispered into the encrypted line. "Listen carefully. There's a specialist Hayes here, logistics. She's carrying the old tag, the crescent mark. I saw it. It's him. She's the daughter. Find out everything. And whatever you do, keep her quiet. The Black Sands truth cannot get out, not now." He hung up, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of his desk. Project Chimera. The name was acid in his mouth. He thought he had buried that ghost forever. Now the ghost was wearing a uniform and carrying a clipboard on his base. The days following the encounter with Colonel Graham were strange and suffocating for Clara. The usual mockery from Sergeant Miller and the other soldiers didn't stop, but it changed. It lost its lazy, everyday quality and gained a cold, watchful edge. Miller was jumpy, barking orders with unusual urgency, and his eyes followed Clara constantly. The other privates either avoided her completely or stared with a new, unsettling curiosity. Clara, recognizing the classic signs of pressure from above, doubled down on her professionalism. She worked harder, moved faster, and became even more ruthlessly efficient. She made herself a perfect, unassailable target, but her mind was miles away, obsessively running the commander's panic against the mystery of the dog tag. She spent her nights deep diving into military history archives, using complex search parameters that bypassed simple keyword searches. She was looking for a unit that had been erased. She finally found a reference, buried deep within a retired general's digitized memoir, under a section marked Regrets. The general briefly mentioned an unofficial designation, Project Chimera. The name sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She cross-referenced it with the year her father, Master Sergeant Thomas Hayes, had been officially listed as MIA-KIA 15 years ago, during what the official records called the Kandahar Collapse. The general's text was vague, but the context was clear. Chimera was a tiny, elite, multi-purpose rescue and intelligence unit. They were legends among the few who knew of them, ghost operators who went into impossible situations. Their last known mission was to secure critical infrastructure during the Kandahar collapse. They never came out. Officially, they were listed as lost in action, but the general hinted at a deeper cover-up. Clara pulled out her father's dog tag again, the crescent with the 3 dashes. A sudden, terrible realization hit her. The stylized crescent wasn't an ID number. It was the Chimera unit's unofficial emblem, a crescent moon symbolizing night operations crossed by 3 lines representing the 3 branches of service that formed the unit. Only Chimera members or the high-ranking officers directly involved in their operations would have known to put it on their tags. Her father hadn't just been a regular NCO. He had been a hero, part of a mythical unit, and his history had been intentionally erased. And Colonel Graham, the man who mocked her and relegated her to hauling obsolete trash, knew her father. Clara's quiet determination hardened into a stone-cold resolve. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking honor for her father's memory and the truth about his sacrifice. Meanwhile, Colonel Graham's secret investigation was in full swing. He had assigned a nervous, loyal major to pull up every scrap of data on Specialist Hayes. Graham sat in his office, reviewing the file, his hands clammy. Specialist Clara Hayes, daughter of Thomas Hayes, Master Sergeant, 1st Ranger Battalion, attached Chimera MIA-KIA 2010. Service record, spotless. Physical performance, exceptional. Unit assessment, reliable but lacking ambition, best suited for non-strategic roles. Graham scoffed at the lacking ambition part. The daughter of Thomas Hayes could never lack ambition. He knew Thomas, a man whose sheer stubborn loyalty was legendary, and Thomas, before he vanished, had a knack for preparing for the worst. Graham remembered the Kandahar collapse with a gut-wrenching clarity. He had been a lieutenant colonel then, managing the extraction of troops. Project Chimera, led by Thomas Hayes, had been deep inside enemy territory, securing the communications tower that allowed the main forces to withdraw safely. They had bought precious time for thousands of soldiers. But when Hayes requested extraction, the enemy had suddenly overrun their positions. Graham, under immense pressure and fearing the loss of his own extraction teams, had made the call. Extraction denied. He wrote the official report saying Chimera was lost before they could be contacted, ensuring that his career and the lives he did save were protected. The truth, that he had left them behind to save himself the risk, was buried beneath mountains of classified paperwork. Now Thomas Hayes's daughter was walking his base, carrying the mark of the ghost he had personally created. Clara, utilizing the very logistical knowledge Miller despised, noticed the first crack in Graham's cover-up. The very crates of obsolete gear she had been moving from Annex B. Why would Graham be so frantic about a Code Zero disposal? The answer was simple. Code Zero meant no classified material, but the urgency suggested the opposite. Graham wanted those documents buried in the trash, not filed away. She remembered the crates, heavy old communications gear. She recalled one specific crate that had been taped shut with specialized yellow-striped sealing tape, not standard Army issue. Clara began making extra trips to the warehouse, ostensibly to tidy up the remaining inventory before disposal. Her eyes were constantly scanning. She knew the original destination of the discarded gear was the base burn pit, a huge, desolate area far off-limits to most soldiers. One afternoon, under the cover of a massive dust storm that had swept across Fort Clay, blurring visibility, Clara requested access to the vehicle depot, claiming she needed to check the fuel levels on the heavy-duty haulers for the next morning. Miller, distracted by the chaos of the storm, grumbled a yes. She didn't check the fuel. She grabbed a small, unmarked Army-issue multi-tool and drove a small, nondescript supply truck to the edge of the abandoned Annex B. She went back down the creaking ramp into the basement's dusty chill. She quickly located the spot where the last of the crates had been stacked before removal. She focused on the shadows. Then she saw it, pushed back into a dark corner, half hidden under a tattered canvas tarp, one single remaining wooden crate. It was the one with the yellow-striped sealing tape. Too heavy for one person, too distinct to be forgotten. It had been left behind. She pried the lid open with the multi-tool. Inside, there was no obsolete radio gear. Instead, there were rows and rows of faded magnetic data tapes, the kind used for secure military logs 20 years ago. And sitting right on top in a clear plastic sleeve was a single official-looking document with a faded seal and the chilling handwritten title. Project Chimera, last log entry, Priority Alpha. Clara's heart hammered against her dog tag. She felt a surge of cold dread and fierce triumph. She was holding the key to the ghost Graham had spent 15 years burying. She carefully, meticulously placed the log and one of the data tapes into her uniform jacket's interior pocket. The weight felt insignificant, but she knew it was heavier than the entire Fort Clay base. The log, which she read quickly by the dim light of her phone, was a formal transmission request from Thomas Hayes, detailing the exact time and coordinates of their location, and the fact that they were still operational and awaiting extraction. The date on the log was 2 hours after the time Colonel Graham's official report claimed they had been lost. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten note scrawled across the bottom, signed by a Lieutenant Colonel B. Graham. Risk too high. Confirm withdrawal of extraction ASSETS. All personnel in zone are classified KIA. Clara stared at the handwriting, her vision blurring with sudden, righteous fury. She had the truth. Her father had been betrayed, and the man who had ordered her around, mocked her, and underestimated her for months was the betrayer. The evidence in her pocket proved her father's heroism and Graham's calculated sacrifice of his own men to save his career. Clara left the Annex B basement with the 2 pieces of evidence hidden securely against her body, the brittle, damning log sheet and the ancient magnetic data tape. The heavy crate was resealed and pushed back, looking exactly as it had before. The dust storm was still raging outside, a gift of nature that blurred the surveillance cameras and muffled the sound of her escape. She knew she couldn't simply walk into Colonel Graham's office with the log. He would tear it up, call her a liar, and crush her career with a single phone call, painting her as a disgruntled specialist tampering with classified materials. She needed to approach this not as a soldier seeking justice for her father, but as a dedicated logistics expert uncovering a major security failure. Over the next few days, Clara used her limited spare time to analyze the old data tape. She didn't have the proper machine for it, but she was resourceful. She found a decommissioned, non-functional data reader among the obsolete gear that hadn't been picked up yet, and she carefully harvested its internal read head, a tiny, complex piece of equipment. Using her soldering skills, she created a makeshift adapter that allowed her to slowly, painstakingly, download the data into a secured, encrypted drive. The data wasn't just a log, it was an audio recording. When she finally managed to play the file in her barracks, the crackling static gave way to a series of tense professional voices. It was the real-time communications log from the Chimera unit's final hours. She heard her father's voice, clear and strong, relaying mission success, coordinates, and requesting the promised immediate extraction. Then came the voice that made her stomach turn to ice. It was Colonel Graham, a younger, slightly higher-pitched version of the man on base now, but undeniably him. Extraction is a negative Chimera actual. Repeat, extraction is denied due to catastrophic risk to forward operating units. Your coordinates are now confirmed hostile. You are classified as an unacceptable liability. Good luck. Then a moment of profound silence from Thomas Hayes, a heavy sigh. Roger that, Lieutenant Colonel Graham. Her father's voice came back, stripped of all emotion, professional until the bitter end. Chimera actual signing off. We confirm receipt of data package Delta 7. This transmission is now going dark. Tell my wife and daughter I always finish the mission. The raw emotion in those words, the cold professionalism masking the utter betrayal, was gut-wrenching. Her father, knowing he was abandoned, had still finished his mission, transmitting a crucial data package, Delta 7, that must have saved the main forces. It was in this period that Colonel Graham made his move. He couldn't find anything on Clara, but he knew the risk. He summoned her to his office, not to sign manifests this time, but for a performance review. When Clara stood before him again, he was back to his old self, imposing, cold, and dismissive. Specialist Hayes, Graham began, leaning back in his chair, tapping a pen on her spotless performance file. Your service here has been adequate. You follow orders, you haul heavy equipment efficiently, but you have no strategic vision. You are a workhorse, not a leader. He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. He then went for the kill, using his knowledge of her father as a weapon. You remind me of certain specialized personnel, highly capable but too focused on the small picture, too impulsive. Your father, Specialist Hayes, Thomas Hayes. Clara didn't flinch, but her hands tightened behind her back. Sir. Your father was a great soldier, Graham said, spinning the truth with vicious casualness. But he failed to follow a clear order for withdrawal. He insisted on a final, reckless push for a communications signal that was unnecessary. His stubborn, emotional attachment to a mission led to the loss of his team. His recklessness cost us resources. It was a tragedy, Specialist, but a tragedy born of his own failure to think strategically. He looked her straight in the eye, injecting venom into the lie. He was dishonored, Specialist. That is why his records are so hard to find. It was covered up out of respect for the family, not for his heroism. You carry his name, and frankly, you are showing the same inability to see the big picture. Therefore, I am reassigning you to a remote observation post in the Nevada desert, effective immediately. The shock of the sudden transfer was immense, but the lie about her father was a punch to the soul. Graham was trying to break her emotionally and ship her off to isolation before she could act. He was denying her father's sacrifice and reclassifying him as a failure to justify his own betrayal. Clara felt the dog tag, the crescent symbol, press against her chest. It was her moment of truth. She could fight the transfer or she could use it. Understood, Colonel, she said, her voice clear and without a tremor. She showed no anger, only simple acceptance. However, regarding the obsolete gear disposal, I believe there has been a critical security failure concerning the Annex B materials. Graham froze mid-smirk. What are you talking about, Specialist? The materials were designated Code 0 non-classified disposal, Clara continued, her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. However, I detected extremely faint magnetic residue on one of the decommissioned hard drives, a residue indicating the presence of encrypted data tapes. tapes that survived the official disposal. If this data is, as you suggested, connected to your father's recklessness, it presents a massive security vulnerability if it falls into the wrong hands. It is my duty to secure it. Clara was playing his game: security, protocol, and fear. Graham swallowed, his composure fracturing again. He tried to brush it off. That's nonsense, Hayes. The area is secure. The data is wiped. With respect, sir, Clara pressed, leaning slightly forward, her quiet strength filling the room. With the data tapes in my possession, I can assure you the security threat is contained. But as I am now transferring out, I need to officially hand over these materials to the highest authority on this base for proper reclassification and logging. She hadn't told him she had the evidence. She had told him she had to hand it over. The distinction made all the difference. Graham paled again. He knew he was trapped. If he let her leave with the tapes, she would expose him. If he demanded she hand them over now, he was confirming they were classified and potentially exposing himself to an immediate charge of dereliction of duty and cover-up. He tried one last desperate threat. Give me the materials, specialist, and I will ensure your father's tragedy remains a quiet footnote. You have no idea what you are messing with. You are playing with fire. Clara held his gaze. Sir, I'm in logistics. I know exactly what I'm moving. I'm simply following protocol for the security of Fort Clay. She then said the one thing that truly unnerved him. I have secured a backup digital copy, just in case of an accidental loss of the physical media. Standard protocol for priority alpha materials, sir. I have already sent the location of the physical tapes to my personal, trusted contact outside the base to hold until my transfer is complete, to prevent unauthorized access. It was a total bluff, but it hit Graham like a tidal wave. He thought she had an accomplice. He thought he had lost control of the data. You idiot, Graham hissed, leaping halfway out of his chair. You have committed a security breach. Clara stood tall. No, sir, I have prevented one, and now I will complete my final duty on this base. She turned and marched out, leaving a gasping, furious Colonel Graham staring at the empty air. The transfer was set for 2 days from now. Clara had just given herself exactly 48 hours to execute her final plan. She had the evidence, she had secured a digital copy, and she was now going to deliver the truth to the one place Graham couldn't touch.